The omega no one could smell. There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't make noise. It doesn't cry in corners or beg for attention. It doesn't announce itself at the dinner table or scream in the middle of a crowded room. No, it's the quiet kind. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone you've carried so long you've forgotten what it felt like to breathe without the weight of it. That's the kind of lonely I am. My name is Lena, and in a world where everything, absolutely everything, is decided by scent, I have none. No scent. Not a whisper of one. Not even the faint, forgettable smell of an omega trying to fade into the background. Nothing. I am, by every measure my pack uses to define worth, a blank page, an empty cup, a wolf with no signature, no mark, no claim on the world around her. You want to know what that means in a pack like Ashenvale? It means they look through you, not at you, through you, like you're made of smoke. Like if they stare hard enough, you might just dissolve into the cold air and stop being their problem. I've been dissolving for 22 years. The snow in Ashenvale never fully melts, not even in the brief weeks when the sun tries its hardest to push through the canopy of pine and shadow that covers this mountain territory. The ground stays white and hard and unforgiving, like the land itself decided long ago that warmth wasn't welcome here. I walk through it every morning before the pack wakes, before the noise starts, before the looks begin and the whispers follow me like a second shadow. I walk with purpose, even when I have none. That's the thing nobody tells you about survival sometimes. The only way to keep from breaking is to pretend you have somewhere important to be. So I pull my coat tighter, tuck my hands inside my sleeves, and I walk like I'm expected somewhere, like someone is waiting for me. And in a strange, quiet way, someone is. The path to the clearing isn't marked on any map the pack keeps. It's not a place anyone goes, not anymore. The trees get thicker the farther you go, the light thinner, the air colder in a way that has nothing to do with temperature. Other wolves avoid it the way you avoid a wound you're not ready to look at. They say the clearing is cursed, that something ancient chose to stop there and never leave. They're not wrong, but cursed things, and I have an understanding. I found the clearing 3 years ago, on a night when staying inside that pack house one more hour would have broken something in me that couldn't be fixed. I'd been assigned the washing again, all of it, every piece of clothing from every warrior in the Eastern Wing, and one of them, a broad-shouldered male named Cade, who thought cruelty was the same thing as strength, had knocked the basin from my hands and laughed while I got on my knees in the mud to pick it all up. I didn't cry in front of him. I never do. But I walked out into that snow and I just kept walking. Until the trees swallowed the pack house lights. Until the only sound was my own breathing and the soft crunch of my boots on frozen ground. And then I stepped into the clearing and I stopped. Because he was there. The legends say that the frozen wolf is a curse. That centuries ago, the most powerful alpha king this territory had ever seen was struck down by dark magic in the middle of a war no one fully remembers. Not killed, no. Death would have been kinder. He was frozen, suspended between one heartbeat and the next, locked inside his own body, his own power, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but exist in that terrible in-between space where time doesn't pass and nothing changes. The pack uses the story to scare children. Stay in line or the frozen wolf will find you. Don't wander or you'll end up like him alone, stuck, forgotten. I always thought the wrong part of that story was used as the warning, because the first time I saw him, I didn't feel fear. I felt something loosen in my chest, some tight, exhausted knot I hadn't even realized I'd been holding for years. He is massive. I want to be very clear about that, because no description I give will fully do justice to the reality of standing near him. In his wolf form, he is larger than anything alive has a right to be. His shoulders reach higher than my head. His paws, each one broader than my entire torso, rest against the frozen earth like they grew there, like he and this ground are the same thing. His fur is the color of deep winter, that particular shade of silver-white that exists right before a storm, and it doesn't move. Not even when the wind cuts through the clearing hard enough to push me sideways. He doesn't move. At all. His eyes are open, pale, almost colorless, like ice held up to moonlight. And they stare forward at nothing, seeing nothing, because whatever magic locked him here took everything from him, his voice, his movement, his future, and left only the shell of what he used to be. He is terrifying. He is the safest thing I have ever known. I started talking to him on the second visit. I don't know why exactly, except that the silence in that clearing was different from the silence I lived in every day. The silence in the pack house was the kind that came from people actively choosing not to speak to you. It had edges, it had intent, it pressed against your skin like something cold and deliberate. The silence in the clearing just was. It didn't want anything from me. It didn't judge what I brought into it, and neither did he. I know you can't hear me, I told him that second morning, standing about 10 feet away, hands shoved in my pockets, breath making small clouds in the frozen air. Or maybe you can and you just can't do anything about it. Either way, I sat down in the snow, closer than the first time. My pack thinks I'm broken, I said, because I don't have a scent, which I know sounds ridiculous if you've never lived in a world where your entire identity is wrapped up in whether or not you smell like something. But here we are. He said nothing. Obviously. You're a better listener than anyone I've ever met, I told him. And then, because the absurdity of it hit me all at once, I laughed. Really laughed, the kind that sneaks up on you and comes out slightly embarrassed, which is both the nicest and the saddest thing I've said out loud in weeks. I started going back every day after that. I would sit closer each time. I'd tell him things I hadn't told anyone, not because I trusted easily, but because he couldn't tell anyone. He couldn't repeat it, couldn't use it against me, couldn't look at me differently afterward. I told him about my mother, who left when I was 6 because raising a scentless pup was too much of a shame to carry. I told him about the ranking ceremony when I was 12, when every unmated omega was assessed and sorted, and I was placed at the very bottom without ceremony or apology. I told him about the way it felt to do the same humiliating work every single day and know that no matter how well I did it, I would never be thanked, never be moved up, never be seen as anything other than the thing they kept around, because even broken tools have their uses. I told him about the longing. That's the one I never said out loud anywhere else. That specific, complicated ache of wanting to be wanted, not even romantically, not necessarily, just wanted in the basic human sense. To matter to someone, to have your absence noticed, to walk into a room and have even one face change because you walked in. I looked at his frozen profile once, at the strong line of his jaw and the way his ears sat alert even in suspension, and I thought foolishly, embarrassingly, I wonder what your voice sounds like. Deep, probably. The kind of voice that doesn't need to be raised to fill a space. The kind that, when it finally says your name, makes you feel like your name was always supposed to sound that way. I shook the thought off. I was doing that more and more lately. I came to the clearing injured on a Thursday. My left side hurt where I'd walked too close to the training yard, and Cade had decided that was invitation enough to shove me into the fence post. Nothing broken. He was too smart to actually break something, too careful to leave marks where the beta might ask questions. Just bruised. Just the particular ache of being handled like you don't quite qualify as a person. I didn't go straight to the clearing. I did the work first, because I always do the work first. Because the one thing I have, the only thing Cade and all the rest of them haven't managed to take from me yet, is that I don't beg and I don't fold. I endure. It's not bravery. I want to be honest about that. Bravery is a choice. What I do is closer to stubbornness, closer to the quiet, grinding refusal to give them the satisfaction of watching me break. But that night, when the pack house finally went dark and the only sound was wind against the windows, I walked to the clearing and I didn't stop at my usual spot on the ground. I walked all the way up to him, and I leaned against his paw. His frozen fur was cold against my cheek, but there was something beneath the cold. Something that felt almost like density, like weight, like presence, and I let out a breath I'd been holding for hours. They're never going to stop, I said quietly. Not sadly, just honestly, the way you say a true thing when you're too tired to dress it up. I know that. I've always known that. But knowing a thing and living inside it every day are two very different feelings. The wind moved through the clearing. His fur didn't stir. "If you were real," I whispered, and my voice came out smaller than I intended, cracked at the edges in a way I immediately wanted to take back. "If you could actually hear me right now, you wouldn't let them hurt me." I closed my eyes. "I think you'd be the kind of person who wouldn't let them hurt me." The clearing was silent. The snow glowed faint and blue in the darkness, and somewhere in the part of me that was still soft enough to want things, I let myself believe just for that one moment that the warmth I imagined beneath his frozen fur was real. That something there, locked deep inside all that stillness and silence and suspended power, was listening. "I want to tell you something about frozen things. People assume that because something cannot move, it cannot feel. That stillness is the same as emptiness. That silence means nothing is happening inside. People are wrong about that. I know because I was wrong about it too. For 3 whole years, I sat beside something ancient and powerful and completely, utterly aware, and I thought I was alone. I was never alone in that clearing. Not once. He heard the first word I ever spoke to him. That second morning, when I sat down in the snow 10 feet away and said, "I know you can't hear me," he heard every syllable. He felt the cold shift of air that came with my footsteps. He registered the specific weight of my presence, the way you register a candle being lit in a dark room, not blinding, not overwhelming, just suddenly, quietly there, where before there was nothing. His name was Caelum, Alpha King of the Ashenvale bloodline, the most powerful wolf born in 4 centuries, sealed inside his own body by a curse that took everything from him except consciousness, except awareness, except the slow, grinding torture of existing, fully feeling, thinking, wanting, while being unable to do a single thing about any of it. For 237 years, he had heard only wind. Wolves came sometimes, in the early decades, warriors testing their courage, young pups daring each other to touch the frozen wolf's fur and run, elders who stood at the edge of the clearing and spoke about him in past tense, the way you speak about something that used to matter. He endured all of it the same way he endured everything in complete, lightless silence, locked behind his own eyes, waiting for something he had stopped being able to name. And then one night, a girl walked into his clearing and laughed. Not at him, or maybe a little at him, at the absurdity of talking to something that couldn't answer. But it was real laughter, the slightly embarrassed kind that sneaks out when you've caught yourself doing something unexpectedly human. And something in that sound moved through 237 years of silence like the first crack in a frozen lake, small, almost nothing, and yet somehow the beginning of everything. He couldn't turn his head to look at her directly. He couldn't shift his gaze or adjust his position by even a fraction. But he could feel her, the warmth of a living body close to his fur, the soft rhythm of her breathing, the particular weight of someone sitting down in the snow like they'd decided to stay. She stayed. She came back. And every morning she returned. He understood something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in longer than most wolves were alive. He understood what it meant to wait for something, to count the hours, to exist inside the dark, suspended silence of his own body and have one point of light to orient himself toward. Her voice. He began to crave it the way living things crave air, not dramatically, not all at once, but with that slow, cellular desperation of something that has gone without for too long and finally remembered what it needed. When she didn't come, the clearing felt different, heavier. The silence returned to its old shape, the shapeless, colorless silence of centuries, and it was worse now for having known the alternative. He told himself it was simply the relief of hearing anything human, any voice, any warmth. He almost believed it, for a while. But then she leaned against his paw one evening and told him about her mother leaving, and something moved through his chest that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with recognition. The specific, wordless recognition of one lonely thing identifying another. And he understood, somewhere beneath the ice and the stillness and the centuries of careful numbness, that what he was feeling was far more dangerous than gratitude. He was becoming attached to an omega with no scent. A girl, his pack, the legacy of his bloodline, The wolves who carried his name without knowing it, treated like a burden they hadn't figured out how to put down yet. The anger that moved through him then was the first emotion in 200 years to feel entirely new. Seasons passed. I know that sounds simple when I say it like that, but I want you to understand what it actually means, what it looks like, what it feels like to grow up beside something that cannot grow with you. I was 19 the first time I found him, 20 when I started coming every day without exception, 22 when I stopped pretending I came for the quiet and admitted, at least to myself, that I came for him. The clearing changed with the seasons in ways the rest of Ashenvale didn't quite match. Spring brought a brief, pale green to the trees at the edges, small wildflowers pushing up through the snow in stubborn little clusters, like they hadn't gotten the message that warmth wasn't particularly welcome here. Summer was short and silver-skied, the light lasting long into the evening in that northern way that made time feel uncertain. Autumn turned the canopy amber and rust, and the leaves fell around him like the world was trying to decorate something it didn't know how to honor. And winter always came back. It always came back hard and permanent and total, burying everything, and he remained exactly as he was, unchanged, unaging, sealed in his moment while everything around him moved forward without him. I aged beside him. He didn't. I noticed it one autumn morning when I was 23. I was sitting cross-legged in the leaves near his front paw, telling him about a dream I'd had the night before, something strange and warm involving a coastline I'd never seen, and a voice I couldn't quite remember upon waking. And I looked up at his profile and thought, "You look exactly the same as the first day I found you." Of course he did. That was the nature of what had been done to him. But it hit differently that morning. The permanence of it, the loneliness of it. To be stuck in one moment forever while everyone and everything around you changed and aged and moved on. To never have a conversation. To never be asked how you were feeling. To never sit down at a table with someone who was glad you'd shown up. "I think you'd hate this," I told him honestly, pulling a leaf from near his paw and turning it in my fingers. "If you could actually experience it, the being stuck. I think someone like you, whatever you were before all this, I think you were probably someone who moved through the world like you owned the ground under your feet. And now you just..." I trailed off. "Now you just have to sit here and let the world happen to you." I set the leaf down carefully, right at the base of his paw. "I understand that more than you'd think. I brought food sometimes. Not for him, obviously, but there was something about eating alone in the pack house that felt different from eating alone in the clearing, and the difference mattered to me. I'd take whatever I was allowed at meals, sometimes a heel of bread or a piece of fruit from the harvest stores that nobody noticed was missing, and I'd sit beside him and eat like we were sharing a meal. I talked with my mouth full sometimes and then apologized, which made me feel ridiculous, which made me laugh, which made the whole thing feel almost normal in a way nothing else in my life did. I brushed snow from his fur on winter mornings. I don't know exactly when that started. It wasn't a decision I made consciously. It was just that one morning there was a heavy snowfall, and when I arrived, his back and shoulders were thick with it, and it seemed wrong somehow to just leave it there. So I climbed up carefully, using the natural angles of his frozen form-like steps, and I brushed the snow away with my forearm in long, slow strokes. It took almost an hour. I came back the next snowfall and did it again. And again. It became its own kind of ritual, quiet and unhurried, and if I noticed that being that close to him, close enough to feel the faint, impossible warmth beneath the cold surface, close enough to press my palm flat against his fur, and hold it there for a moment longer than strictly necessary, if I noticed that it made something in my chest go very still and very full at the same time, I didn't say it out loud. Some things you protect by not naming them. He was the only place I felt safe. I knew that completely and without embarrassment by the time I was 24. Inside the pack house, I was always braced, always waiting for the next dismissal, or the next cruelty, or the next reminder that I occupied the lowest possible position in a hierarchy that had no patience for anything it couldn't categorize. But in the clearing, I let my shoulders drop. I let my jaw unclench. I sat in the snow with my back against the solid, frozen warmth of him, and I let myself be a person instead of a problem. That meant everything. You cannot understand how much that meant. The vote happened on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I had been assigned laundry again. It was always laundry on Tuesdays, and I was halfway through the third basin when the beta's second came to find me with that particular expression people wear when they're delivering news they're not sorry about. The pack had voted. Scentless wolves, the Elder Council had ruled, were a liability in a territory already under pressure from neighboring packs. They drew no hierarchy markers, created confusion in dominant structures, and provided, and I remember this word specifically, because it lodged in my chest like a splinter, insufficient contribution to pack functionality relative to the resources spent maintaining them. Insufficient. I was insufficient. Banishment was the formal term. Dawn execution if I was still within pack borders when the sun came up. They gave me until midnight to gather what I had and go, which was generous, someone said, which told you everything you needed to know about what they thought I had. I don't remember walking to the clearing that night. I remember the snow, and the dark, and the cold that went all the way through my coat and didn't stop, and then I was there, standing in front of him. And for the first time in 4 years, I didn't have anything to say. I stood in front of him for a long time, just breathing. And then I pressed my forehead against the frozen ice of his fur, right at the place where his jaw met his neck, and I cried. Not the careful, managed kind of crying. I allowed myself in private, the kind with no sound, the kind you do with your eyes closed and your hand over your mouth so nobody hears evidence of your breaking. I mean the real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep it doesn't ask permission. The kind that sounds like something being torn. I cried until I had nothing left, and then I stayed pressed against him with my eyes closed and my hands gripping his fur, and I said it the thing I had been circling for 4 years, the thing I had protected by not naming it, the thing that now, at the end of everything, had nothing left to lose. I wish you were real. My voice was wrecked and small, and I didn't care. I wish you were real, I said again. And this time it came out differently, not desperate, but honest in the way that only happens when you've lost the energy to be anything else. Not for anyone else. Not so the pack would leave me alone or so I'd have somewhere to go. Just I wish you were real because I think I've spent the last 4 years falling in love with someone who doesn't exist. And I don't know what that says about me. I don't know if it's sad or if it's just the most honest thing I've ever done. The wind moved through the clearing. His fur didn't stir. I pressed my palm flat against him one last time, feeling that deep, impossible warmth beneath the ice. And I thought one last time about a voice I had imagined 100 different ways. A voice that would say my name like it was the only word in the sentence that mattered. Goodbye, I whispered. I pulled my hand back, and then the cold rushed in to fill the space where I had been standing, and I turned to walk away, and somewhere behind me, in the silence of a clearing where nothing had moved in 237 years, I heard something crack. I stopped walking. I don't know if I made a conscious decision to stop, or if my body simply refused to take another step, the way it sometimes does when something inside you knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. One moment I was moving toward the tree line, toward the dark and the cold and the road out of Ashenvale that I had no real plan for, and the next moment I was completely, utterly still, because the sound I had just heard was not the wind. I know what the wind sounds like in that clearing. I had been listening to it for 4 years. I knew the way it moved through the pine at the north edge differently than the south, knew the particular pitch it made when a storm was building 3 ridges away, knew the difference between the creak of frozen branches and the settling of snow weight, and every other ordinary sound that clearing made when it was just itself and nothing more. What I had just heard was not any of those things. It was the sound of ice breaking from the inside. I turned around slowly. The way you move when your brain is at war with itself, half of it screaming to run, the other half so desperately hungry for this particular thing to be real that it would risk anything to find out. He looked exactly the same. Silver-white fur, massive and unmoving, pale eyes fixed forward at nothing. The clearing was still. The snow was still. My own heartbeat was the loudest thing for 3 full seconds, and I almost convinced myself I had imagined it that grief had finally done what 4 years of loneliness hadn't quite managed. and I was hearing things that weren't there. And then his eye moved. Not his whole head, not his body, just his eye, that pale, almost colorless iris that I had looked at 1,000 times in the fixed, vacant way of something long emptied out. It shifted. Slowly, like something waking up through layers and layers of stone, like the first movement of a glacier, like something enormous and ancient choosing, after a very long time, to look. It shifted, and it found me. I stopped breathing. For a moment that lasted longer than any moment I have experienced before or since. We simply looked at each other, me standing at the edge of the clearing with tears still drying on my face and nowhere left to go, and him, still frozen, still locked, but looking at me with eyes that were suddenly and terrifyingly full of something that had not been there before. Then his jaw moved. It moved the way something moves when it's fighting against an enormous and sustained resistance, grinding, fractured. A sound like a mountain shifting, and frost fell from the hinge of it in sheets, and the ice that had sealed his lips cracked in a jagged line, and the sound that came out was nothing like I had imagined. It was rougher, broken in ways that made sense for a voice that hadn't been used in over 2 centuries, fractured and deep and raw, like something dragged up from a place that had been sealed shut for so long the opening of it hurt. But it was a voice. It was his voice. And the first word it said, the only word, just the one, barely above a whisper, was my name. Lena. I made a sound I have no name for. Something between a gasp and a sob and complete, total disbelief. My hand came up to cover my mouth. My knees wanted to go. I held myself upright through nothing but the shock of it, the pure electric shock of hearing my name from a mouth I had spoken to for 4 years, in the complete certainty that it would never, ever answer. He said it like he had been holding it, like it had been sitting in his chest for a very long time, worn smooth from being kept so carefully, and releasing it cost him something real. He looked at me like I mattered, not the way people look at useful things. Not the way my pack looked at me when they needed another pair of hands for work they didn't want to do themselves. He looked at me the way you look at something you thought you'd lost, and then found at the last possible second, with a kind of fierce, desperate relief that had no interest in being dignified about itself. I took 1 step toward him, then another, my body making the decision before my mind could argue. I pressed my hand against the ice of his jaw where it had cracked, right where his voice had come through, and the cold that met my palm was different from every other time I had touched him. It wasn't the sealed, permanent cold of something fully locked. It had given it, a vibration beneath the surface, like something straining against a door from the other side. "You heard me," I whispered. It wasn't a question. Looking into those eyes, awake now, fully awake, burning with 237 years of awareness, finally finding a face to land on it, wasn't a question at all. You heard everything. The ice under my hand cracked further. A branching fracture, moving upward toward his cheekbone like a river finding its course, and frost fell in a soft, glittering cascade around my fingers. And then the clearing was no longer just ours. I heard them before I saw them, which is saying something, because I had no scent to warn me, no pack bond to send ripples of alarm through my system the way it did for wolves with proper connections. What I heard was the specific crunch of multiple sets of feet moving through snow with the kind of coordinated, deliberate quiet that meant they weren't lost and they weren't passing through. They stepped out of the trees on the eastern edge. 7 of them, in dark clothing that had seen better decades, with the particular look of people who have organized themselves around a belief system that has done nothing good for their faces. I had heard about rogue cultists in the border territories, wolves who had broken from their packs and built something strange and angular in the space that was left, who chased old power with the desperation of people who felt owed something by the universe. They were looking at him, all 7 of them, staring at the frozen wolf with the specific, calculating hunger of people who had been looking for something for a long time and had just found it. One of them looked at me. The growl that came from behind me was not fully formed. It was rough and incomplete, and clearly came from a throat that had not made sound in centuries, but it was unmistakable. It filled the clearing the way thunder fills a valley, not loud so much as everywhere, vibrating in my sternum and the soles of my feet and the base of my skull simultaneously. His lips pulled back. I could see it in my peripheral vision, the massive curl of them, the flash of teeth that were the size of my hand. He couldn't move his body. The curse still held him. But the sound he made when one of the cultists took a step toward me was the most articulate thing I had ever heard without words. It said stop, and it said mine, and it said I am still here all at once, in a frequency that communicated to something ancient in every wolf present, that the thing they were assuming about this situation was dangerously incorrect. I stood very still. Then, from the western edge of the clearing, more footsteps. These I recognized the cadence of Ashenvale warriors, moving in formation, and at the front of them, the beta's second with his arms crossed and his expression carrying that particular compound of contempt and bureaucratic satisfaction that people wear when they believe they have the authority in a situation. The Omega is pack property until dawn, he said, to the cultists and to me equally, as though I were an object being disputed rather than a person standing in the middle of it. After that, she's yours to deal with, the territory's problem, whatever. But right now she hasn't been officially released, so whatever you're planning, the growl shifted pitch. Every single person in that clearing went still. It wasn't louder than the first one. It was more specific. It had a target, and the target was anyone who was currently treating me like a thing to be collected. And the message it carried was clear enough that even the beta's second, who was not a person with a particularly refined sense of self-preservation, took an unconscious step backward. He was trying to move toward me. I could feel it, not see it, because his body held the same position it had for centuries, but there was a trembling in the air around him, a vibration that pressed against the curse like a fist pressed against a wall, something enormous and furious pushing against a barrier that had, for 237 years, refused to give. He had never fought the curse before. He was fighting it now. For me, I don't know what made me do it. Rational thought had mostly left the building. By this point, there were 7 cultists and a pack delegation in the clearing. The only person who was in any way on my side was currently encased in ancient magical ice, and I had no weapons, no pack bond, no scent to mark my position in any hierarchy that might earn me even a moment of consideration. What I had was 4 years of sitting beside something ancient and learning, without meaning to, what it felt like to be near genuine power. What I had was a body that remembered the warmth beneath the cold surface of him, that had pressed against him in grief and exhaustion and inexplicable comfort enough times to know where to put my hands. So I turned around. I walked back to him while people on both sides of the clearing made sounds of confusion and warning. I walked back to him and I pressed myself against his chest, both hands flat, forehead down, my whole body in contact with the frozen fur, and I stopped trying to be careful about it. I stopped managing it. The thing in my chest I had never had a name for, the thing that the pack called defective and the elders called insufficient, and that I had spent 24 years learning to keep very small and very quiet and very controlled so that nobody could find it and use it against me. I stopped holding it down. I let it come up. It came up like water through cracked ground, like something that had been compressed for so long that the moment the pressure released it had nowhere to go but everywhere through my hands, through my palms pressed flat against him, through every point of contact between my body and his, and the cold that met it didn't stop it. It conducted it. It moved it upward and inward and through, and the ice beneath my hands began to crack. Not the small, branching fractures from before. This was different. This was structural. The sound of it was enormous. A deep, resonant breaking that started at my hands and moved outward in all directions, up his chest and along his shoulders, and down his forelegs to the frozen earth. And the people behind me were shouting now, and I didn't look back because I couldn't. Because what was happening beneath my hands required everything I had, every bit of the thing I had never been given a name for. Every year of quiet, desperate wanting, pouring through my palms like light through broken glass. The ice exploded. Not violently, not the sharp, dangerous explosion of something destroyed. The way a shell opens, the way something that has been waiting inside a sealed thing finally gets room to become what it always was. Frost and ice, and the particular sharp cold of 200 years of suspension, filled the air around us in a glittering, suspended cloud, and beneath my hands, something breathed. A full breath. The first full breath. I felt the chest expand against my palms, massive and real and warm. Genuinely warm now. Life warm. The warmth of a living thing coming back to itself after the longest absence imaginable. He exhaled, and his body came down around me like a wall between me and everything else. One enormous paw on either side of where I stood, head lowering until I was completely enclosed, shielded so thoroughly that the cultists and the pack and the cold night air and every other threat in that clearing might as well have been in a different world. The first full breath he drew was not the clearing air. It was mine. I heard him inhale low, deliberate, his nose dropping to the crown of my head, and the sound that followed was not a growl and not quite a word, but something in between. Something with texture and recognition and the specific, speechless communication of a person encountering something they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. He had spent 4 years hearing me speak, and now free, breathing, real in a way he hadn't been in over 2 centuries. The first thing he did was search for the scent everyone else had told me I didn't have, and find it. He had a scent too. I registered it the same moment he registered mine, the way 2 things recognize each other simultaneously, like a key and a lock encountering each other for the first time and understanding immediately, without explanation, that they were made with the other in mind. His scent hit me like the first warm air after a winter that has gone on too long. Deep pine and dark earth, and something underneath both of those things that had no name in any language I knew, something that reached into the oldest part of me and said, "Here, the way you feel when you walk into a place you've never been, and understand immediately that you have been looking for it your whole life without knowing what you were looking for." I had spent 24 years being told I had no scent. What I understand now is that I had no scent for them. That the thing inside me, the thing the pack called a defect, the absence they used to define everything wrong with me, wasn't an absence at all. It was a lock. It was a seal around something specific and extraordinary that had been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for the one thing capable of opening it. Him. His first full breath found me, and mine found him, and the clearing went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the people standing in it. The cultist who moved first made a mistake. He was the tallest of them, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been made to understand consequence in any lasting way, and he stepped forward with his hand outstretched toward me like I was something to be collected, something in the clearing that belonged in his inventory rather than in my own body. Caelum moved between us before the man's next breath, not gradually, not the slow, grinding resistance against the curse that I had felt when he was still half-sealed. He moved like something that had been compressed for 2 centuries, finally given room sudden and total, and with a controlled violence that was somehow more frightening than anything uncontrolled could have been. One moment there was space between me and the cultist's outstretched hand. The next moment there was an Alpha King filling that space, and the difference in scale was not subtle. He was larger in full form than I had registered when he was frozen. Or perhaps the frozen version had muted something, some quality of presence that living things carry and statues don't, some frequency that a body in full possession of itself emits that changes the air around it. Whatever it was, he had it now, and the clearing responded to it the way a room responds to thunder, everything in it going still and small and instinctively aware of its own size in comparison. He did not look back at me. He kept his eyes on the cultist, and his voice, when it came, was everything I had spent 4 years imagining, and nothing like any of it simultaneously. No one touch her. 3 words, quiet enough that he didn't need to raise his voice, which somehow made it worse for them, I mean. A person who shouts is a person who needs the volume to carry the weight of the thing they're saying. A person who says a thing like that in a voice like that is a person for whom the words are entirely sufficient on their own. The cultist stopped moving. The others behind him looked at each other with the rapid, reassessing expressions of people recalculating a situation they had badly misread. They had come for the frozen wolf, for the power source, the ancient magic, the sleeping king they thought they could claim or control or use. They had not come prepared for the frozen wolf to be awake, standing, and currently positioned between them and an omega with tears still drying on her face. They had not come prepared for him to look at that omega the way he was looking at me. I couldn't see his face from where I stood behind him, but I could see theirs. And whatever was on his face when he glanced back at me for half a second, that brief checking glance, the one that said still there, still safe in the specific shorthand of someone who has just oriented their entire concern in one direction. Whatever was on his face in that moment changed the calculation for every person in that clearing. This was not a wolf defending territory. This was something older than that. The cult leader, to his credit, tried once more. He straightened his spine and summoned what authority he had, and said something about ancient rights of claim, about blood magic and the old laws, about the power the frozen wolf represented, belonging to the territory at large, rather than to any single wolf or pack. Caelum turned his head toward him. Just his head. The rest of him didn't move. "She freed me," he said. Still quiet, still controlled. Every word chosen and placed with the precision of someone who had spent 2 centuries listening and had therefore developed a very clear understanding of what words were actually for. She spoke to me when no one else remembered I existed. She brushed snow from my fur in the dark when there was no one to see her do it and nothing to gain from the kindness. The clearing was absolutely silent. "You will tell me," he continued. And now there was something beneath the quiet, something ancient and enormous. The particular authority of a wolf who was born knowing how to fill a room with his voice without raising it. "What claim you believe you have here that is greater than hers?" Nobody answered, because there was no answer. He had made the accounting perfectly clear and there was no argument that survived contact with it. And the cultists were many things, but they were not, apparently, stupid enough to try one. They left. Not quickly enough to be embarrassing for them, but they left. The Ashenvale delegation was a different problem. They had the law on their side, or they believed they did. The Beta's second was the kind of man who derived his entire sense of safety from the law being on his side, and he stood at the edge of the clearing with the expression of someone trying to determine whether the situation had changed enough to require changing his position on it. Caelum turned to face them, and the Beta's second, to his credit, lasted almost 4 full seconds before he took a step back. "The banishment order," Caelum said, in a tone that suggested he was aware of it and was about to explain what he thought of it, "was issued by a council operating under the authority of the Ashenvale bloodline. Pause. I am the Ashenvale bloodline. It landed the way things land when they are simply true, and everyone in the vicinity has just been made aware of it simultaneously." The delegation looked at each other. The Beta's second opened his mouth and then closed it again with the expression of a man rapidly performing internal calculations about his immediate future. "She is not banished," Caelum said. "She is not Omega. She is not defective. She is not insufficient." His voice didn't waver on any of those words, but something in the way he said each one of them, the specific weight he gave to insufficient, the particular stillness around defective, told me that he had been carrying those words since the day I first said them out loud in the clearing, and that he had spent 4 years wanting to answer them. "What she is," he finished, "is mine to protect, and I am telling you that I will." The delegation left, and then it was just us, just him and me in the clearing and the snow and the night, and all the frost that had fallen when the ice broke still glittering in the air around us like the clearing was trying to mark the occasion. He turned to face me fully, and I understood, looking at him for the first time without the barrier of ice and suspended time between us, that I had managed to imagine his eyes accurately, pale and almost colorless and completely, entirely focused on me in a way that made the ground feel uncertain under my feet, not from fear, nothing like fear, but from the specific vertigo of being seen by something that powerful with that degree of intention. The mate bond hit me 3 seconds later. I say hit because there is no softer word for it. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't the gradual, slow-building warmth I might have imagined if I'd let myself imagine it, which I hadn't, which I specifically hadn't done because it was the one thing I had protected most carefully from hope. It was immediate and total and seismic, a snapping into place that happened somewhere below conscious thought, below language, in the oldest possible layer of what I was, and it rearranged everything it touched on its way through. I felt him. Not physically, we weren't touching, but I felt him the way you feel. A fire from across a room. The warmth of it, the specific quality of its presence, the way the air moves differently in relation to it. I felt the outline of him through something that had no name in any science I knew, some channel that had just opened between us like a river finding the course it was always supposed to run. And through that channel, for just a moment, I felt what he felt, which is how I know that he was trembling. He didn't look like he was trembling. Standing there in the clearing, the size of something ancient and impossible, he looked like exactly what he was, the most powerful alpha this territory had produced in 4 centuries. Fully present, fully awake, fully himself for the first time in over 200 years. But through the bond, I could feel the tremble in him, fine and deep, and not from weakness, from the specific, particular terror of someone who has wanted something for a very long time and is now standing close enough to it that the wanting has become responsibility. He was afraid of the wrong move, afraid of the clumsy word or the overwhelming gesture, afraid that 2 centuries of stillness had left him without the vocabulary for this specific, delicate, necessary thing. He was afraid of hurting me. The size of him, the power of him, the absolute authority he had just demonstrated toward everyone else in that clearing, and the thing he was most afraid of, the thing that made his hands enormous, capable of crushing stone, hang carefully at his sides rather than reaching for me, was the thought of being too much. For me, I don't have a word for what moved through my chest then. Something between recognition and heartbreak and a tenderness so acute it almost felt like pain. I had spent 4 years talking to something I thought couldn't hear me, telling it every truth I was too afraid to say anywhere else, and the whole time it had been listening, he had been listening and learning me, and carrying every word, and now he was standing in front of me free and awake, and mine in the way that Bond said unmistakably that he was, and he was scared to reach for me. I took a breath, and then I stepped back. He went very still. Not the frozen stillness of the curse this was chosen, controlled, the stillness of someone giving full attention to something they don't want to misread. I need you to understand something, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. 4 years of talking in that clearing, I supposed. 4 years of saying true things out loud with no guarantee of anything in return. Before this goes any further, before the bond or the territory or any of the rest of it, he waited. I have spent my entire life being told what I am by people who decided before they looked, I said. I have been categorized and ranked and found insufficient by people who never asked me a single question about who I was or what I wanted. And I survived all of it, not because I was rescued and not because the situation changed, but because I kept going when there was no particular reason to. I held his gaze, those pale, ancient, fully present eyes. I am not going to trade one form of not being asked for another. I don't care what the bond says. I don't care what the old laws say about mates and alpha claims and what an omega owes a king. I am not going to belong to something I didn't choose. The clearing was silent. So I need to know, I said, that you understand the difference between a bond and a choice, and that you know which one I require. Something moved across his face. Not offense, nothing like offense. Something that looked, in a way I hadn't been prepared for, like relief. Like the specific, profound relief of a person who has been waiting for someone to finally ask the right thing. He moved. Slowly, deliberately, in the way he did everything with the full weight of his attention and without any performance of it. He moved until he was standing directly in front of me, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to keep his eyes, and then he did something I will carry in my chest for the rest of my life. He went down on one knee, in the snow, in the clearing where I had sat alone for 4 years, where I had brushed frost from his fur in the dark and eaten bread beside him, and told him every truth I was afraid to say anywhere else. In front of the glittering remains of the ice that had held him, and the cold that had kept him, and the long, patient years that had brought us both to this exact moment, he knelt, and he looked up at me, and his voice was still rough from centuries of disuse, but it was certain in the way that only things chosen freely can be certain, and he said, "I will earn you." 4 words, quiet enough that they didn't need the night air to carry them anywhere except exactly where they were meant to go. "I do not ask for your submission," he said. "I do not ask for your trust before I have built it, or your loyalty before I have deserved it. I ask only for the chance to try." A pause brief, waited. "You freed me, not with power, with presence. With 4 years of choosing to come back when you had no reason to believe anything would come of it." His eyes didn't leave mine. "I have been awake for 237 years, he said. "I have listened to wind and silence and the world continuing without me, and I have felt nothing that moved me to fight the curse. Nothing until you." The snow was falling again, fine and quiet, the kind that falls when the wind has gone still and the world is just letting it happen. "You asked me to understand the difference between a bond and a choice," he said. "I do. The bond is what we are. The choice is what I am asking for the chance to become." He stayed on his knee, waiting. Not demanding, not assuming, waiting, in the way that only someone who genuinely means it can wait with patience and steadiness and no expectation of the answer. I looked down at him, this ancient, impossible, terrifying, careful thing, and I felt the bond humming between us like a string that had just been tuned for the first time, and I felt my own chest doing something complicated that I was going to need a significant amount of time to fully understand. I extended my hand, not in submission, not in surrender to the bond or the old laws or any claim that wasn't mine to give. I extended it the way you extend your hand to someone who has just asked to walk beside you, and left it to them to decide what to do with the offer. He took it, both of his enormous hands, careful and warm and real. In a way I was still adjusting to real, in the way that only things you have wanted for a long time, without letting yourself admit it, are real when you finally get them. And he held my hand like it was something worth being careful with. And in the clearing where nothing had moved for 2 centuries, where I had sat alone and talked to the dark and kept going when there was no good reason to, the snow fell soft and quiet around us both. And for the first time in 24 years, I was not alone. The first thing he did, the morning after the clearing, was ask me what I needed, not what the territory needed, not what the bloodline required, or what the old laws dictated, or what 2 centuries of frozen precedent suggested was the appropriate next step for a newly awakened alpha king with a complicated political situation and a mate bond that half the remaining pack structure didn't know what to do with. He asked what I needed. We were standing at the edge of the tree line, the pack house visible through the pines in the gray early light, and I had been bracing for the conversation about next steps, about logistics, about the careful management of a situation that had approximately 14 different ways to go wrong before breakfast. I had been preparing my most practical face, the one I had worn for 24 years, the one that said, "I am fine and I require nothing and I will handle whatever comes," and then he looked at me and asked that question, and the practical face did something embarrassing. "I need them to stop being afraid of me," I said, when I trusted my voice again. "The Omegas, the ones who've been assigned to the lower work details. They flinch when anyone walks into a room too quickly, and they eat what's left after everyone else is done, and they have that specific way of making themselves small that takes years to learn, and I know exactly how long it takes because I learned it too." He listened. That was the thing I had to keep adjusting to, the active, full attention listening, the kind where the person receives what you say and actually does something with it rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He had spent 2 centuries developing the skill, and it showed, and being on the receiving end of it was both wonderful and slightly destabilizing, because I had structured most of my communication around the assumption that no one was really paying that much attention. "Then that's where we start," he said. "They came slowly at first. Word moves through a pack the way water moves through stone, not quickly, but with a persistence that eventually changes the shape of things. The first Omega to find us in the clearing was a girl named Sura, 17 years old, with a split lip that was 3 days healed, and eyes that moved to the exits in every room she entered. She stood at the tree line for almost 20 minutes before she came any further in, and when she finally crossed into the clearing, she looked at Caelum with the braced, careful expression of someone who has learned through sustained experience that large males in positions of power are a specific category of danger. He took 3 steps back, without being asked, without making a point of it, or waiting for acknowledgement. He simply moved back, creating space between himself and the entrance of the clearing, and then he sat down, which, given his size, was its own kind of statement, because sitting reduced him by half and he did it anyway, and he waited. Sura looked at him, then at me. "He does that," I told her. "Gives you room." It took me a while to trust it too. She came in. By the end of the 2nd week, there were 11 of them. By the end of the month, 19. They came with split lips and tired eyes and the careful, contained movements of people who had learned to take up as little space as possible. And they sat in the clearing and they talked. And Caelum listened to every word with the same full attention he had given to me for 4 years in the dark. He didn't speak much in those early gatherings. That was intentional. I could feel it through the bond, the deliberate restraint, the conscious choice to receive rather than direct. He understood, without being told, that a room full of wolves who had spent their lives being talked at needed to experience being listened to before they could begin to trust that the listening was real. But when he did speak, every person in the clearing heard it. He called the first formal council meeting on a Thursday. Not in the pack house. The pack house carried too much of the old hierarchy in its walls. In the specific arrangement of the tables and the positioning of the chairs, and the dozen small architectural choices that communicated, without saying it, who mattered and who was there to be managed. He called it in the clearing, because the clearing was neutral ground, and because neutral ground was what we needed. I sat beside him, not behind him. Not at the far end of the arrangement, in the position traditionally assigned to unbonded omegas in advisory roles, which was to say, as far from the center of the conversation as was technically still possible to call present, beside him, at the same level, with my own voice in the proceedings and my own weight in the room. The first time I spoke in council, every head turned. Not because what I said was remarkable, it was a practical point about the rotation of lower pack work assignments, about the way the current system concentrated the most physically demanding labor in the smallest pool of the least fed wolves, which was both cruel and strategically inefficient, neither of which should have required stating aloud, but did. It wasn't remarkable. But the fact of it, an omega, speaking in council, not reporting or requesting but contributing, landed with a weight that had nothing to do with the words. Caelum didn't look at the heads that turned. He looked at me, and his expression was the one I was beginning to learn, as his listening expression still, attentive, genuinely engaged with what was being said, and then he said, simply, "She's right. Change the rotation." That was the first time. It was not the last. The courtship happened in the spaces between the politics. I want to be precise about this because the word courtship implies something formal, and what Caelum did was almost the opposite of formal. Formal would have been easier for him in some ways. He understood ceremony, understood the weight of tradition and the language of old protocols. What I had asked for was different. What I had asked for was choice, and choice required something that ceremony didn't. It required him to be uncertain, to try things and not know if they would land, to be, in some fundamental way, vulnerable. He was terrible at it at first, and that was the thing that made it real. He brought me things, not grand gestures, nothing that announced itself or demanded a response. Small, specific things. A book about the old pack structures that predated the current council system, because I had mentioned once, offhand, that I had always wanted to understand the history of how things were organized before they calcified into what they'd become. A piece of bread from the kitchen that was still warm, left near my usual seat in the clearing without comment, on a morning when I had come out early and hadn't eaten. A sprig of the small white flowers that pushed up through the snow at the clearing's edge, set on the windowsill of the room I'd been given, with no note because he didn't leave notes, which somehow made it more effective than a note would have been. "You don't know how to flirt, do you?" I said to him one afternoon. We were sitting in the clearing in the thin winter sunlight, going over the council notes from the morning, and he had just spent 30 seconds adjusting the angle of the book I was reading so that the light hit the page better, without interrupting what I was saying, and when he finished he sat back and looked almost satisfied, and I had to put the book down. He considered this. With the seriousness he applied to everything, full attention, genuine processing. "I know what I am doing," he said finally. "I am not certain it has a name." "It has a name," I told him. "It just usually involves more eye contact and less book repositioning." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, he was still finding those. 2 centuries of not needing them meant they came slowly and with some effort, but the suggestion of one, the shape that a smile would take if he let it the rest of the way out. "I will practice," he said. "Please don't," I said. "It's working." He pulled back when he should have. That was the other thing, the thing that cost him something and that I could feel through the bond when it happened. There were moments, in the clearing or walking the territory boundary or sitting across from each other in council, when the bond made its presence known with a particular insistence that was not subtle and not patient, and not interested in either of our carefully maintained boundaries. There was a morning in the 4th week when we were reviewing a territorial map, and he reached past me to point to something on the eastern edge, and his hand warm, real, close enough to my arm that I could feel the heat of it stopped. Just stopped, in the air, close enough that a small shift would have been contact. The bond said, "Close the distance." He pulled his hand back, and I felt through the bond what that cost him, not as complaint, not as resentment, but as simple truth. The feeling of someone choosing patience because they believe what they're waiting for is worth the waiting. It moved through me and settled somewhere in my chest, and made it very difficult to concentrate on the eastern boundary for the rest of the morning. I didn't close the distance, not that day, but I let my chair sit a little closer to his after lunch, and I didn't explain why. He didn't ask. But through the bond I felt something warm and quiet, like a fire that had been carefully tended and was finally, reliably, holding its own heat. The council confrontation came on a gray Tuesday, 3 weeks into what the oldest members of the Ashenvale Elder Table had taken to calling the irregular arrangement, which was their preferred term for, "We don't know what to do with this and it makes us uncomfortable." There were 7 of them, seated in the half-circle formation they used when they wanted to communicate institutional gravity, and they had requested a formal audience, which Caelum granted because he was not, whatever else had changed, a person who avoided hard conversations. He walked into the council room with me beside him. Not behind him. Not at the advisory position to his left, the one that communicated consultation without authority. Beside him, in the full parallel positioning that said, "To anyone reading the old protocols, she speaks with my voice and I with hers." The eldest council member, a wolf named Drevin, 70 years old, and built like he had never once in those 70 years considered the possibility of being wrong, looked at our positioning, and then looked at Caelum with the specific expression of a man preparing a statement he had rehearsed. "The old laws regarding mate bonds and omega classifications," he began, "have been reviewed," Caelum said. Quiet. Certain. "I have read every law this council operates under. Several of them are internally inconsistent. Several more rely on classifications that were not established in good faith, and that I intend to revisit formally." Drevin's expression shifted. "The Alpha King's return is not a return to what was," Caelum said. "What was allowed an Omega with no scent to be assigned humiliating work and called defective, and voted for banishment by dawn execution while she was still in the territory." The room was very quiet. "What was," he continued, "kept me frozen in a clearing for 2 centuries while the wolves carrying my bloodline forgot I existed. I am not interested in restoring what was." Drevin looked at me then, with the particular look of a man who has decided the problem is the woman in the room, the Omega's influence on the kings. I spoke. "My name is Lena." I didn't raise my voice. I had learned, sitting in a clearing beside something ancient and powerful, that you don't need to raise your voice when what you are saying is true. I am the Alpha King's mate and an equal voice in this council. You will use my name or you will not address me. And if there is something you want to say about my influence, you can say it directly and we can discuss it as adults. Silence. Caelum's hand found mine under the table. Not visibly, we were both looking at the council, our postures steady and parallel, and no one in the half-circle could see it. But his hand covered mine, warm and certain, and through the bond came something that wasn't words, something quieter and more specific than words, the particular feeling of someone standing next to you, not because they have to, but because there is nowhere they would rather be. I pressed back. Dreven, to his credit, straightened in his chair and redirected. "The council has concerns," he said, "about the speed of the structural changes being proposed." "The council's concerns are noted," Caelum said. "They will be addressed through proper process, slowly, if that is what's required." A pause. "But they will be addressed." The meeting ended an hour later with no resolution and no collapse, which was, in the language of council politics, a kind of progress. Dreven and his 6 colleagues filed out with the careful expressions of people recalibrating, and the room emptied until it was just us. Caelum didn't move his hand from mine. I looked down at our hands, his enormous and warm, mine smaller, and still learning what it felt like to be held by something that had no interest in holding me down, and I thought about the clearing, and the snow, and 4 years of talking to something I thought couldn't hear me. "That went well," I said. He made a sound that I had learned, in 4 weeks of close proximity, was his version of a laugh, low and brief and slightly reluctant, like it surprised him when it came out. "It went," he said. "Same thing," I told him. "And through the bond, warm and steady and entirely real," he agreed. "I want to tell you exactly when I knew. Not when the bond snapped into place, that was its own thing, enormous and undeniable. But a bond is biology and fate, and the old machinery of wolf nature doing what it was built to do. That's not a choice. That's a fact. And I had spent enough of my life having facts decided for me that I needed this particular thing to be different. I knew on a Wednesday morning, 5 weeks after the clearing, when I woke up before dawn and couldn't sleep and walked to the window of my room and looked out at the territory in the gray pre-light, and found him already there. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, looking out at the same gray nothing I was looking at, and he had clearly been there for a while. Still and quiet in the way he sometimes was, not the frozen stillness of the curse, but the chosen stillness of someone who had learned, across centuries, how to simply exist inside a moment without needing it to be anything other than what it was. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't reviewing council documents or walking the boundary or managing the 100 small crises that came with rebuilding a pack structure from its foundations. He was just standing in the cold, early dark, and as I watched, he tilted his head back slightly, and I understood from the quality of the movement that he was listening to the territory, the particular, attentive listening of an alpha taking the measure of something he loves and is responsible for. And then, without turning around, without any indication that he'd heard me at the window, which he had, because he always heard everything, he went still in a slightly different way. The way a person goes still when they become aware of being seen by someone whose seeing matters to them. He didn't turn. He just waited. And I stood at that window and felt the bond between us, steady and warm and entirely without demand, and I thought about every morning I had walked to that clearing alone, every season I had sat in the snow and talked to something I believed couldn't hear me, telling it my truths because there was nowhere else to put them, every time I had pressed my hand against frozen fur in the dark and felt that impossible warmth beneath the cold and told myself I was imagining it. I had not been imagining it. He had been there. The whole time he had been there listening, present, carrying every word I'd given him with a care I hadn't known was possible, from something that couldn't move or speak or reach for me. He had waited 2 centuries for something to move him, and when I walked into that clearing, frightened and defiant and entirely unaware of what I was walking into, he had started, for the first time in longer than most bloodlines remembered, to hope, not because of fate, not because of the bond or the bloodline or the old laws, because of me. Because of the specific, irreducible, entirely unremarkable fact of me, my voice, my stubbornness, my embarrassing habit of apologizing to a frozen wolf for talking with my mouth full, my refusal to stop coming back, even when there was no logical reason to keep coming. He had chosen me before I had the option to choose him, and now I had the option. I got dressed and I went downstairs and I walked out into the cold gray morning and across the frost-hardened ground to where he was standing at the tree line. And when I reached him, I didn't say anything for a moment. I stood beside him and looked out at the same gray territory and felt the bond between us doing what it always did, steady, warm, present without insisting. He looked down at me, those pale, ancient eyes, fully awake, fully here. "I choose you," I said. Not dramatically, there was no performance in it, no grand declaration assembled for an audience. Just me, standing in the cold morning, saying the true thing. Not the bond, not the mate claim, or the alpha king, or the political reality of what we are to each other in the territory's eyes. You, the thing you are when it's just us in the clearing and you move 3 steps back to give Sura room before she asks for it. The thing you are when you reposition my book without interrupting me. The thing you were for 4 years when you couldn't do anything except listen and you listened anyway. Like what I was saying mattered. Like I mattered. I paused. "I choose that. I choose you." He was very still. And then he reached up, slowly and with the full attention he gave everything, and his hand came to rest against the side of my face, careful, warm, enormous in relation to my jaw, holding me like I was something worth being careful with, and he lowered his head until his forehead rested against mine. He stayed there for a moment, just that, forehead to forehead, the bond running between us like a current finding ground, both of us breathing the same cold morning air. "Lena," he said, "just my name, just the one word," in that rough, certain voice. I had imagined, for 4 years, what it might sound like to have him say my name like it was the only word in the sentence that mattered. I had not imagined well enough. I closed the distance. The kiss was not tentative. I want to be clear about that I had done enough waiting, enough careful management of wanting, enough pulling back from edges I had every right to step off. I kissed him like I meant it, like I had meant it for years, and for half a second he was still with the shock of it, and then he was not still at all. He was careful with the hunger. I could feel the effort of that carefulness through the bond, the specific, sustained restraint of someone with 2 centuries of wanting, and the awareness that wanting alone is not sufficient reason to take, and it was somehow more affecting than if he had simply let it go. His hands held my face and my shoulder with a gentleness that was deliberate and chosen, the gentleness of someone who is capable of not being gentle, and is choosing this anyway, because I matter more than the wanting. But the wanting was there. It was absolutely there in the bond, and in the quality of the kiss, and in the way his breath changed, deep and unsteady, when I pressed closer. It was unmistakable, and it was mutual, and it was, after everything, entirely ours. When we broke apart, the morning was lighter. The gray had gone pale gold at the edge of the sky, and the frost on the ground caught it and held it, and the clearing behind us glittered with it, the frost that had fallen from his ice still there, still catching the light, marking the place where everything changed. He looked at me, eyes open, fully present, something on his face that had no name in the old protocols, something new, something that belonged only to the specific fact of us. "Again," I said. The smile came all the way out this time. "We designed the mating ceremony ourselves. This was not, in the history of Ashenvale tradition, how it was done. The old ceremony was formal, and fixed a predetermined ritual that communicated the Alpha's claim, the Omega's acceptance, the Pack's witnessing. It was performed in a specific order with specific words that had been unchanged for so long that half the Pack recited them from memory without knowing what they originally meant. Caelum and I sat with the old texts for 3 evenings and read every ceremony recorded in the Bloodline's history. He was methodical about it, working through the oldest documents with the careful attention of someone who had been frozen for 2 centuries and had therefore developed no opinion about the inconvenience of primary sources. I was less patient, which meant I found things faster and he understood them better, and between the 2 of us we built something that had never existed before. Not a claiming, not an acceptance, something equal. We held it in the clearing, because of course we held it in the clearing. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that makes the stars look closer than physics allows. And every wolf we had gathered around us was there by choice, not summons, not obligation, not the careful attendance of people managing their position in a hierarchy. Sura was there, her split lip long-heeled, standing straight in a way she hadn't when she first came to us. The 19 Omegas who had found the clearing and stayed. The council members who had, over weeks of careful work, begun to understand that what was being built here was better than what had existed before, even if better was slower and harder and required them to be uncertain. Drevin was there. In the back, with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, which was, for Drevin, a significant emotional concession. Caelum stood across from me in the center of the clearing, at the exact spot where the ice had been, where the frost still glittered in the snow because the clearing kept it. He was in his human form, which he was still navigating with the particular patience of someone relearning a skill after a very long absence, and he was looking at me with that expression I had learned, the one that was only for me, that had no formal name and needed none. We had written vows. His came first, because I had asked him to go first, because I wanted to hear his before I said mine, not to calibrate or adjust, but because I had spent 4 years imagining his voice and I still wasn't entirely accustomed to having it and I wanted it, in this specific moment, without anything in between. I spent 2 centuries in silence, he said, learning the difference between existing and living. His voice was steady and certain and quiet, the way it was when he meant something completely. You walked into that clearing and you talked to something you believed could not answer you, and you came back every day and you told it true things, and you were kind to it when kindness cost you something. He paused. I will spend whatever time I have trying to be worthy of that. Not your submission, I do not want your submission. Your trust, your choice. Your voice beside mine in every room that matters. Another pause, and something shifted in his eyes. Something warmer. Something that was almost the smile, but quieter and deeper. And your company in the clearing. Always your company in the clearing. I had thought I was prepared. I was not prepared. My vows were simpler, because after his, there was really only one true thing left to say. You heard me when no one else was listening, I said. You waited for me when you had no reason to believe I was coming. You moved back to give Sura room before she asked. You knelt in the snow and said I will earn you like earning me was the thing worth doing. I looked at him fully, without flinching, without the careful management of being seen that I had practiced my whole life. You already have. I am here because you already have, and I will be here choosing you every day, not because the bond says so, but because you are the specific, particular, irreplaceable person I want to be beside. The pack witnessed. We pressed our palms together, mine small against his enormous one, and the bond that had been building since the first morning. I sat down in the snow and said, I know you can't hear me completed itself. Not snapping, not the violent seismic event of the initial recognition, but a settling, a deep, full, permanent settling, like the last piece of a thing clicking quietly into the place it was always supposed to occupy. Through the bond, I felt him feel it too. And through the bond, he sent me something that had no words, just warmth and certainty, and the specific, profound relief of someone who has been waiting for the right thing and has finally stopped waiting. The new pack took its shape the way good things take shape slowly, without announcement, through the accumulation of small and consistent choices made by people who had decided what they wanted to build, and were willing to do the daily work of building it. Sura became the first formal voice of the Omega Council, a structure that had not existed in Ashenvale before us, and that the elders had initially described as structurally redundant, which told you exactly how threatened they were by the idea of people they'd previously ignored having a formal mechanism for being heard. She ran the first meeting with her shoulders back and her voice steady and a clarity of purpose that made me quietly proud in a way I didn't entirely have words for. The clearing remained. A clearing, not a throne room, not a ceremonial site preserved behind glass. We still went there, sometimes together, in the evenings when the day's work was finished, sitting in the same spot where I had once sat alone and talked to the dark. Sometimes I went alone, in the early mornings before the pack woke, for the same reason I had always gone, because it was mine, and because the quiet there was still the good kind of quiet, the kind that didn't have edges. Caelum was learning things. The flirting improved, though I maintained my position that the book repositioning approach had been effective in its own specific way, and he was welcome to keep it in rotation. He was learning jokes, slowly and with great sincerity, and delivering them with the grave certainty of a person who has decided to learn a language and is going to learn it correctly, which made them funnier than they had any right to be. He was learning how to sit in a room without filling it with authority, how to be present without being dominant, how to make space without disappearing from it. I was learning too. Learning what it felt like to walk into a room and have someone's face change because I walked in. Learning to eat first, at the beginning of the meal, without calculating what I was allowed. Learning to take up the space I occupied without apology, without the careful shrinking that had taken years to develop, and was taking its own time to undo. We were both, in our own ways, still learning how to live inside a life that had not been the plan. There is a kind of peace that doesn't arrive. It doesn't knock or announce itself or come in a single identifiable moment you can point to and say, there. That was when things got better. It builds. Quietly, the way the small white flowers push up through the snow at the clearing's edge stubbornly, without permission, in the middle of conditions that shouldn't support growth, simply because something in them is more committed to living than the cold is committed to stopping them. That's what we built. Not perfection, the council still had its difficult days, and Drevin still crossed his arms in the back, and Caelum still sometimes filled a room with more authority than he intended when he was tired, and I still sometimes woke up at 3 a.m. with my chest tight from a habit of bracing that 24 years had carved too deep to disappear overnight. We were not a fairy story. We were two specific, complicated, thoroughly imperfect people trying to build something better than what came before. But the pack ate together now. All of it, every rank, at the same tables, at the same time, from the same preparation. It had taken 4 months of consistent insistence, and 2 deeply uncomfortable confrontations with the kitchen hierarchy, and the first meal where it actually happened without incident. I sat at that table, and felt something I recognized as happiness in a way so simple and complete that I almost didn't know what to call it. Caelum noticed. Through the bond, always through the bond, that steady warm current that never demanded anything and never went quiet, he felt it, and across the table his eyes found mine, and he did the thing with his mouth that was more than a suggestion now, the full version, the one he'd been practicing. He smiled at me. I smiled back. They once called me defective. They said I had nothing to offer, no scent to mark my place, no rank to justify my presence, no value sufficient to outweigh the inconvenience of my existence. They voted to put me out of the territory by dawn, without ceremony, without apology, with the bureaucratic efficiency of people disposing of something they had never bothered to see clearly. And I walked to a clearing in the dark, to say goodbye to the only place I had ever felt safe, and I pressed my hands against 2 centuries of frozen ice and I broke it open. Not with power, though the power was there, it turned out. Not with magic or rank or any of the things this world uses to assign worth to wolves who weren't asked their preference on the matter. With presence, with 4 years of choosing to come back, with the specific, stubborn, ordinary miracle of continuing to show up for something you love, even when there's no logical reason to believe it will ever answer. It answered. He answered. And now the strongest wolf in the world, the alpha king of the oldest bloodline in these mountains, the wolf who speaks in rooms and makes the walls remember it, the wolf who fought 2 centuries of dark magic and won kneels only to me. Not because I demanded it, because he chooses it. Every day, in the small and ordinary ways that matter more than ceremony, moving back to give someone room before they ask, repositioning the light so I can see better, sitting in a clearing in the early morning cold and listening, really listening, like what I have to say is the thing worth hearing. He chooses it, and I choose him back. That is the whole story. That is every bit of it. And I would not trade a single cold morning of it, not the loneliness or the snow or the 4 years of talking to the dark for anything easier, because easier would not have been this. And this, it turns out, was everything. Thank you for listening to another emotional, magical shifter romance here on Moonbound Romance Tales. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, heart-gripping romance stories.